Chapter 4. When the Riviera season ended in May, the Rostovs and all the other Russians closed their villas and went north for the summer. The Russian Orthodox Church was locked up, and so were the bins of rarer wine, and the fashionable spring moonlight was put away, so to speak, to wait for their return. "We'll be back next season," they said as a matter of course. But this was premature, for they were never coming back anymore. Those few who straggled south again after 5 tragic years were glad to get work as chambermaids or valets de chambre in the great hotels where they had once dined. Many of them, of course, were killed in the war or in the Revolution. Many of them faded out as spongers and small cheats in the big capitals, and not a few ended their lives in a sort of stupefied despair. When the Kerensky government collapsed in 1917, Val was a lieutenant on the Eastern Front, trying desperately to enforce authority in his company long after any vestige of it remained. He was still trying when Prince Paul Rostov and his wife gave up their lives one rainy morning to atone for the blunders of the Romanovs, and the enviable career of Morris Hasselton's daughter ended in a city that bore even more resemblance to a butcher shop than had Chicago in 1892. After that, Val fought with Denikin's army for a while until he realized that he was participating in a hollow farce and the glory of Imperial Russia was over. Then he went to France and was suddenly confronted with the astounding problem of keeping his body and soul together. It was, of course, natural that he should think of going to America. 2 vague aunts with whom his mother had quarreled many years ago still lived there in comparative affluence. But the idea was repugnant to the prejudices his mother had implanted in him, and besides he hadn't sufficient money left to pay for his passage over. Until a possible counter-revolution should restore to him the Rostov properties in Russia, he must somehow keep alive in France. So he went to the little city he knew best of all. He went to Cannes. His last 200 francs bought him a third-class ticket, and when he arrived, he gave his dress suit to an obliging party who dealt in such things and received in return money for food and bed. He was sorry afterward that he had sold the dress suit, because it might have helped him to a position as a waiter. But he obtained work as a taxi driver instead and was quite as happy, or rather quite as miserable, at that. Sometimes he carried Americans to look at villas for rent, and when the front glass of the automobile was up, curious fragments of conversation drifted out to him from within. Heard this fellow was a Russian prince. No, this one right here. Be quiet, Esther. Followed by subdued laughter. When the car stopped, his passengers would edge around to have a look at him. At first he was desperately unhappy when girls did this. After a while he didn't mind any more. Once a cheerfully intoxicated American asked him if it were true and invited him to lunch, and another time an elderly woman seized his hand as she got out of the taxi, shook it violently and then pressed a 100-franc note into his hand. "Well, Florence, now I can tell him back home I shook hands with a Russian prince." The inebriated American who had invited him to lunch thought at first that Val was a son of the Tsar, and it had to be explained to him that a prince in Russia was simply the equivalent of a British courtesy lord. But he was puzzled that a man of Val's personality didn't go out and make some real money. "This is Europe," said Val gravely. "Here money is not made. It is inherited, or else it is slowly saved over a period of many years, and maybe in 3 generations a family moves up into a higher class. Think of something people want, like we do. That is because there is more money to want with in America. Everything that people want here has been thought of long ago. But after a year and with the help of a young Englishman he had played tennis with before the war, Val managed to get into the Cannes branch of an English bank. He forwarded mail and bought railroad tickets and arranged tours for impatient sightseers. Sometimes a familiar face came to his window. If Val was recognized, he shook hands. If not, he kept silence. After 2 years, he was no longer pointed out as a former prince. For the Russians were an old story now. The splendor of the Rostovs and their friends was forgotten. He mixed with people very little. In the evenings, he walked for a while on the promenade, took a slow glass of beer in a cafe, and went early to bed. He was seldom invited anywhere because people thought that his sad, intent face was depressing, and he never accepted anyhow. He wore cheap French clothes now instead of the rich tweeds and flannels that had been ordered with his fathers from England. As for women, he knew none at all. Of the many things he had been certain about at 17, he had been most certain about this, that his life would be full of romance. Now, after 8 years, he knew that it was not to be. Somehow, he had never had time for love. The war, the revolution, and now his poverty had conspired against his expectant heart. The springs of his emotion, which had first poured forth one April night, had dried up immediately, and only a faint trickle remained. His happy youth had ended almost before it began. He saw himself growing older and more shabby, and living always more and more in the memories of his gorgeous boyhood. Eventually, he would become absurd, pulling out an old heirloom of a watch and showing it to amused young fellow clerks who would listen with winks to his tales of the Rostov name. He was thinking these gloomy thoughts one April evening in 1922 as he walked beside the sea and watched the never-changing magic of the awakening lights. It was no longer for his benefit, that magic, but it went on, and he was somehow glad. Tomorrow he was going away on his vacation, to a cheap hotel farther down the shore where he could bathe and rest and read. Then he would come back and work some more. Every year for 3 years he had taken his vacation during the last 2 weeks in April, perhaps because it was then that he felt the most need for remembering. It was in April that what was destined to be the best part of his life had come to a culmination under a romantic moonlight. It was sacred to him, for what he had thought of as an initiation and a beginning had turned out to be the end. He paused now in front of the Café des Étrangers and after a moment crossed the street on impulse and sauntered down to the shore. A dozen yachts, already turned to a beautiful silver color, rode at anchor in the bay. He had seen them that afternoon, and read the names painted on their bows, but only from habit. He had done it for 3 years now, and it was almost a natural function of his eye. "Un beau soir," remarked a French voice at his elbow. It was a boatman who had often seen Val here before. "Monsieur finds the sea beautiful?" "Very beautiful. I too. But a bad living except in the season. Next week, though, I earn something special. I am paid well for simply waiting here and doing nothing more from 8 o'clock until midnight." "That's very nice," said Val politely. "A widowed lady, very beautiful, from America, whose yacht always anchors in the harbor for the last 2 weeks in April. If the privateer comes tomorrow, it will make 3 years. Chapter 5. All night Val didn't sleep. Not because there was any question in his mind as to what he should do, but because his long stupefied emotions were suddenly awake and alive. Of course he must not see her, not he, a poor failure with a name that was now only a shadow. But it would make him a little happier always to know that she remembered. It gave his own memory another dimension, raised it like those stereopticon glasses that bring out a picture from the flat paper. It made him sure that he had not deceived himself. He had been charming once upon a time to a lovely woman, and she did not forget. An hour before train time next day he was at the railway station with his grip, so as to avoid any chance encounter in the street. He found himself a place in a third-class carriage of the waiting train. Somehow, as he sat there, he felt differently about life, a sort of hope, faint and illusory, that he hadn't felt 24 hours before. Perhaps there was some way in those next few years in which he could make it possible to meet her once again, if he worked hard, threw himself passionately into whatever was at hand. He knew of at least 2 Russians in Cannes who had started over again with nothing except good manners and ingenuity and were now doing surprisingly well. The blood of Morris Hasselton began to throb a little in Val's temples and made him remember something he had never before cared to remember. That Morris Hasselton, who had built his daughter a palace in St. Petersburg, had also started from nothing at all. Simultaneously, another emotion possessed him, less strange, less dynamic but equally American, the emotion of curiosity. In case he did, well, in case life should ever make it possible for him to seek her out, he should at least know her name. He jumped to his feet, fumbled excitedly at the carriage handle and jumped from the train. Tossing his valise into the check room, he started at a run for the American consulate. "A yacht came in this morning," he said hurriedly to a clerk, "an American yacht, the privateer. I want to know who owns it." "Just a minute," said the clerk, looking at him oddly. "I'll try to find out." After what seemed to Val an interminable time, he returned. "Why, just a minute," he repeated hesitantly. "Where? It seems we're finding out. Did the yacht come? Oh, yes. It's here all right. At least I think so. If you'll just wait in that chair." After another 10 minutes, Val looked impatiently at his watch. If they didn't hurry, he'd probably miss his train. He made a nervous movement as if to get up from his chair. "Please sit still," said the clerk, glancing at him quickly from his desk. "I ask you. Just sit down in that chair." Val stared at him. How could it possibly matter to the clerk whether or not he waited? "I'll miss my train," he said impatiently. "I'm sorry to have given you all this bother. Please sit still. We're glad to get it off our hands. You see, we've been waiting for your inquiry for, 3 years." Val jumped to his feet and jammed his hat on his head. "Why didn't you tell me that?" he demanded angrily. "Because we had to get word to our client. Please don't go. It's too late." Val turned. Someone slim and radiant with dark, frightened eyes was standing behind him, framed against the sunshine of the doorway. "Why?" Val's lips parted, but no words came through. She took a step toward him. She looked at him helplessly, her eyes filling with tears. "I just wanted to say hello," she murmured. "I've come back for 3 years just because I wanted to say hello." Still Val was silent. "You might answer," she said impatiently. "You might answer when I'd just about begun to think you'd been killed in the war." She turned to the clerk. "Please introduce us," she cried. "You see, I can't say hello to him when we don't even know each other's names." It's the thing to distrust these international marriages, of course. It's an American tradition that they always turn out badly, and we are accustomed to such headlines as, "Would trade coronet for true American love," says Duchess, and "Claims Count Mendicant tortured Toledo wife." The other sort of headlines are never printed, for who would want to read? "Castle is Love Nest," asserts former Georgia Belle, or "Duke and Packer's daughter celebrate golden honeymoon." So far there have been no headlines at all about the young Rostofs. Prince Val is much too absorbed in that string of moonlight blue taxicabs which he manipulates with such unusual efficiency to give out interviews. He and his wife only leave New York once a year, but there is still a boatman who rejoices when the privateer steams into Cannes Harbor on a mid-April night.